Hello and welcome to Property Matters, a show weekly, of course, which looks at all matters property and designed to be of interest to anyone who has an interest in property. And Property Matters is, of course, sponsored by Town and Country Property Auctions London and Fairview International Limited. So, as always, we've got lots to discuss and we'd welcome your comments on our programme underneath the video you're watching now. And by the way, it isn't the 4th of April. For some reason, it says today that it's the 4th of April on your Facebook or YouTube channel. We'll sort that out for next week. It is definitely the 11th of April, I can assure that you of that. And we'd love your comments as we are live today for the show. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you get notifications of when we go live as and when that happens. And you can also email us, of course, propertymatterstv@gmail.com should you wish to do so. Joining us, of course, our resident property expert, Joe Joshi. And this is the most hirsute you will ever see us, because I, for one, after this programme, will be queuing and putting my tent outside the barber's, waiting for tomorrow morning. It's never been such a hairy show, this one.
See that, Paul?
I can see that, yes. Yes. You look like a 4th division footballer from the 1970s.
The girls have been doing plats on that, so so it's quite interesting. I think the 4th of April is slightly a delay on that April Fool's that you should have been doing, isn't it?
Yes, it's a delayed April Fool. Yes,
like delayed reaction that we're getting on that one, Paul.
We live and learn each week with Property Matters, that's for sure.
Yeah. So good morning, Paul, and it's always good to be live. I like these live things because the idea behind that always is that you can make the blunders as you go along, and show off your hairdos at the same time. So it's good news. But first and foremost, of course, this week I've got my Guards Polo Club tie on, a tribute to our president. And of course, may he rest in peace, the Duke, who passed away this week. Windsor is only down the road, so it's home territory to us and you, and we go through that all the time. So it's a sad day to see Mr. Blunder himself, because he's always was used to be knowing to put his foot where it didn't really matter. But then I think that was the lovable robe that we all loved about him, because you just never knew what was going to come out next.
Nope.
And that will be sorely missed. So I wish him a restful peace. He's done a long job, a huge duty. I don't really think, other than Her Majesty the Queen, that we can actually put a hand on our heart to say that there is one person in this entire world that has ruled and reigned as long as those two have. Presidents and prime ministers seem to come and go. The revolving door and the ever political scene continues to happen, but these two have been steadfast, and I think a great model to what really life should be all about. But behind every closed door, there's always a few bun fights, but the facade has always been good. So that's important to say.
Indeed, and well said as always, Joe. Let's take a look at our first story this week. Halifax has estimated this week that the cost gap of being on the property ladder and renting, so the difference between the two, has widened significantly over the past 12 months. It does vary across the country, of course, but first-time buyers are on average £824 better off. Property purchases in London, meanwhile, are a whopping £4,606 better off than if they rented in the capital. And the lowest place in terms of the gap, the smallest gap, is in Northern Ireland, where they are £539 better off. So how they work that out? It's based on the housing costs associated with the mortgage on a 3-bedroom property compared to the average monthly rent. So an interesting statistic, Joe, but that's a whopping figure in London, isn't it? £4,500 better off if you buy rather than rent, and it's widening every year.
Yeah, because, as Boris had said a few months ago, that he wants to make this a generation to buy, not to rent. And I think that is probably a good indication for those that are looking to buy, to say that this is the right step. This is the way they should consider, and where first-time buyers should really sort of put their energy into. But it's difficult. It's difficult for the people that are not in a position to do that. So, of course, the investors will take advantage of the rental market, and it's down to supply and demand again. London is always a huge draw, and it will be a huge draw back very soon, sooner than our counterparts in other parts of the world, because we are a little bit ahead of the game, and so people will want to come here as soon as they can, and that means also the rentals will get back up to speed as time goes on. I think the way I'd like to really say this is not until you actually stop, and that's when you realize what's good and what's bad. When we've been on that sort of treadmill for years and years and years, and people buy, people rent, people move, it just goes on. This last 12 months or so has kind of made people just stop in their stride and think, hang on a minute, let me just think about this. Is this the right way? Do I do this? Is it, and they've had time to think. That's a key thing. And that's what's happening in the rental market and the sales market. And all of a sudden, people have been home and saying, okay, maybe I've got the opportunity to buy as opposed to rent. So the gap has grown there. But I'm sure, as you like your statistics and figures, in 3 or 4 months' time, it will be a reverse, purely because of supply and demand.
It's interesting that their analysis shows that rental costs have increased by 10% to £821 in the last year, but the buying costs have only increased by 1%. So the gap is widening each year. And it's still, despite the fact that the Prime Minister says he wants generation buy, not generation rent, the fact of the matter is that deposit still is the biggest hurdle for renters, especially when they're paying rent at the same time. So the average first home deposit, says the Halifax, has gone up by another £11,000 since the beginning of the pandemic. So those poor people that are trying to save for a deposit who are renting, it's just getting further and further and further away from them. Another 11,000 they've got to find since last year.
Yeah, and that will grow again. But to be honest with you, if I look back over the years, it's never actually been any different. It's just that the proportions have changed. And I look back and started in 1980 or circa that sort of time when I, started in the property business. The first property that I sold was £34,950. Now, even 95% of that borrowing was way out of the grasp of people at that time. To borrow to get 5% mortgage or 10% mortgage was just as difficult then at that price as it has and is now, because everything else is relative. It's just that I think when you focus on the one item and you think, my God, it's hard for me to get this deposit together, but then people were earning at a different level, values were at a different level, and so subsequently deposits were still at a different level. But now that's moved forward. You think about the average income. I think it's the statistics are something like £23,000 or £24,000 a year. Is the average number. But when you go back, and I hasten to say the day that I started selling property, and I'm sure if Guy was listening, he'd probably join me and say that you were lucky if you're getting a couple of grand a year out of it, because that's how it was. It was based on the fact that you were getting commission and so forth. So it is relative, but yes, you're absolutely right in pointing out that it is getting further and further away from that, and that's where the banks of mum and dad have been coming in, because equity has grown in those properties. So imagine, the children that, when you bought or I bought, those values are now much higher. Okay, some people are refinanced and then giving it to their kids, but that's where the bank of mum and dad came in at a high level, because they had equity in the property and they could take that out and give that opportunity for their children to get on the property ladder.
Interesting that research shows that the average renter now pays £64,000 in rent before they actually buy.
Scary, isn't it, really? When you think that £64,000 is something that, is a huge amount of money that they could actually be putting that towards.
Well, it's a deposit.
Yeah. But how do they
Interesting.
get there? That's the scheme. That's the challenge. You know, it's you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you don't rent, you can't have a place. And if you're saving, you're not going to move out your mum and dad's place potentially. And of course, mum and dad are going to turn around and say, well, it's time you moved out because this freeloading business and I'm not doing your washing for nothing isn't going to go on forever. So, you know, the proverbial argument will continue, and sooner or later someone's going to slam the door and say, I'm going, you know, and so they've got to rent. And when they're renting, they're going to pay. So it's a tough one, but when you put it like that and say £64,000, it's quite a lot of money to think that I've just sort of given that away in a way. But I guess it's part of the cycle of living.
Do you think it's tougher for millennials to buy now than when we bought?
Yeah, I think it is. I think there is no question about that, because the numbers were different and the finance facilities that were available were much, much different than they are now. You know, I suppose they weren't as tight and as astute as they are. There was, you know, people were creative in how they wanted to get there, the support. I mean, don't forget, in terms of lending, you know, each mortgage can have more than one person or two people on that borrowing. And that is a huge thing that most people actually don't realize. So back in the early days, I remember doing mortgages where family would get involved. So there were 4 people on the application. As 4 people's income that was considered in order to do that. And then they broke off at each time as the property was getting up in value. Then, you know, 2 would fall off, and then the other 2 would support the other 2 and take the money out of the property and put it in. So there was a huge sort of family operation going on in order for everybody to be successful, to get on the property ladder, to be an investor. And that is not so much the case now, because, you know, the millennials, as you would say, are too astute and too smart, and sometimes almost too smart for their own good, because they actually realize that, you know, the reality of life is still not different, but they just feel that, you know, they're just in another century, and you can't tell them until they actually come back. We can do it our way, and then gradually they come back to you and they say, well, actually, we might need your help to do this. So it's an education thing, but I think more than anything else that there's still, you know, opportunities where lenders will consider lending to more than just the 1 or 2. The difference is, Paul, that some of these, you know, one people are probably on a salary of, I don't know, 50, 40, 50, 60,000. So they think that I could do it all by myself. But I don't think can, you know, it's because the value has changed. So they still have to go back to the basics. As one prime minister said many years ago, and they've been trying to go back to the basics forever, haven't they? You know, we go back to basics. We always go back to basics. And the basics are that, you know, you need a certain number of people. You need the help. You need the support. You can't do it all by yourself.
No, indeed. Second story, interesting one for you, this one. So, improving the home buying and selling process should begin with the agents. Why don't agents suggest that the sellers instruct conveyancers when they take the property on? Even if they just open up a file and get the title deeds, get the plan and a completed PIQ, let alone getting any searches done, that would just help the process, says Rob Hailstone, who is a conveyancer, who's saying that basically the long and short of it is that in the 1970s, this whole process was done in person. So the title, properties were unregistered, title contracts were often exchanged by hand or post, completions were always done in person, and yet those conveyancing times were quicker than they currently are now. So an interesting point he makes. What's your view?
You really want my view on this one, didn't you? This Rob fella needs to take stock of his thoughts, really. Putting the onus and the blame at the doorstep of agents is probably very, very unfortunate for him from my part. So I would say that he really needs to maybe come out of the 1970s and just come back into the reality. And the reality is, Paul, that agents are employed. So I need to make it very clear. Estate agents are employed to do one part of that role, and that is for buyers and sellers. For sellers to instruct an agent, because they are marketeers. They go out to the market and find the right buyers, and that is where fundamentally the agent's job stops. You find a buyer and you introduce it to the seller, they agree a price, and guess what happens? Funny enough, it goes into the hands of these proverbial conveyancers that say that it's somebody else's fault. And there it lies. It sits there doing nothing until such times as they think that someone's actually chasing them. And then they find it very annoying that someone chases them because they haven't done their job. So the easiest thing for them to do is to turn around and say, it's down to the agent. But if they were really smart, which some of them are, I'm not saying they're all that way, because some that have had the opportunity of working with people like me will realize that we try and get these things instructed way ahead so that they can actually open that file. But opening a file and actually putting something into it or doing something with it, Paul, is very different to actually saying, well, I've opened a file. I mean, I open loads of files every day and I close them. It doesn't mean that they don't do anything, because you're not going to do any activity with them. It's not going to go anywhere. And that's what happens with solicitors and conveyancers. They actually open the files and then they just put them on the side and pass the buck to somebody else to do it. Now, there are things like agents, which we have done for many, many years, and they started doing this no sale, no fee scenario. So if you want to go back longer, people would actually pay for a service. Now they don't pay for any service because agents are the worst people for themselves, and the people that earn the best out of it are the customer, because agents start to say, oh, I'll do that for nothing because the other agent will do it for this. And the reality of it is you end up with nothing out of it until such time as the sale happens. But in the meantime, you have to set the file going. You've got to do that. So really the process should be that the seller instructs the agent takes on the instruction, finds the buyer. Once they've found the buyer, they should pass it on to the solicitor and say, here you are. But at the time of instruction, when the seller has instructed the agent, the seller should instruct their conveyancer, but they don't. It's got nothing to do with the agent. The seller should instruct their conveyancer, but they don't. Guess why they don't do that, Paul? They don't do it because the solicitor or the conveyancer starts to say, the meter starts to run, and I'm going to start charging you for opening my file. By the way, it's got nothing in that file, but he's going to start charging you for opening that file. So the seller chooses not to instruct the solicitor or the conveyancer and waits. He waits until such times there is a buyer found. And then, even then, they wait until the buyer maybe has had a survey done on their property to show that they're serious about that transaction. It is only then they will consider instructing their conveyancer or their solicitor. And that is now. So imagine, we started in January the 2nd at the beginning of the year of an instruction, and you didn't find a buyer till middle of February, and the guy who's down it hasn't put his mortgage application, and now in the middle of end of February, beginning of March, before the survey done. Whose fault is that? That's the process. And buyers won't spend money because they think they haven't got it, and sellers won't spend money because they think their meter's going to start running. So I have to point out to this little chap that he needs to really stop and think about where that problem lies. Now, if a good conveyancer was there and a good lawyer, where there are some of those people, they will open the file. They will do all the basic work because they know at some stage, but maybe they won't spend the money on the searches and the actual monetary part of it. But the rest of the stuff can be done quite easily. That's just communication. I mean, today, things are done online a lot. So you can go to land registry and you can actually download the deed and you can get all that information. They all have those passwords to do these things. Back in the day, we used to have to write to the lender and get the lender. So let's say take Halifax, for example. The solicitor would have to write to the lender and say, you are holding a set of deeds for this property which you mortgaged and I'm now selling. So the bank would have to go to the deed safe and get the deed sent to the solicitor, for them to start to do the convey. I mean, the process is still archaic, but a bit more modernized. But the fault really lies, time-wise, the fault lies with the conveyancer.
But that's Rob's point, isn't it? Because in those days you did have to go and do all of that in person or write and use snail mail and all the rest of it. And he's saying that still, even then, it took less than the on average 163 days that it now takes. And the other thing that's really weird is the fact that it's can take 163 days on average. But if you live in the east of England, you can do your conveyancing in 138 days. But if you have the misfortune to live in the southwest, it'll take you 222 days.
Well, they don't sell many houses in East England, so there's more space and countryside and space there. They've got the chance and the time, but if they move to the reality of the world, they'll realise the pace is a bit faster over here. That's the difference.
Bob Singh's joined us this morning. Morning, Bob. We have a system, he says, where sellers do searches and preps a legal pack when they start the process, as well as a reservation agreement. They calls that a mini exchange. It sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's about education, isn't it? It's educating, and those that work now with historical people like Bob, myself, Guy, we have relationship with law firms and things who actually understand and do the things that they do. But there's this huge this modern world that exists who don't do nothing until they've got it on their iPad or on their smartphone, and they think it's all going to happen tomorrow because it's so quick. But it doesn't happen that way, and then they choose people not local to them. That's the other scary thing, Paul. They never choose people that know the area and knowledge. They'll pick up somebody from the other side of the world because he's £2 and a penny cheaper than the one down here. What they don't value is here is a value of a property, the biggest investment they are likely to make in their life. And then they cut the corners by picking somebody in the middle of nowhere for £2 and a penny cheaper. I mean, it's beggars belief, really. But hey, if that wasn't the case, I wouldn't be here doing my job, would I? So I've got to have a mind about something.
I'm glad I found a story that got your ackles up this morning.
You knew that anyway.
Story number 3 this morning. Government releases details of the new tenancy mediation service. They announced this in February, Joe, and we did talk about this the other week. We were saying that the Landlords Association were talking about the fact that they've never seen so many cases being prepared to come to court when they can, with 6 or more months arrears on them, and that the courts are going to be clogged up. Well, the government's now saying that basically this new mediation service is going to sit between the landlord and the court, if you like, and offer a mediation service within 10 days of it being referred to them, which is quite a promise. And then obviously if they can, a bit like a marriage guidance, I suppose, for the tenant and the landlord, if they can come to some kind of agreement, then the case will be referred back to the court and ultimately closed if that all works out fine, which seems like a sensible move from Robert Jenrick.
It's called creating another line of management, Paul. And then when the new man comes along, he comes with a new broom, and then the middle management that they've created, that have actually done nothing in the middle of it, gets brushed away, and we start again. The system is there. The system has been proven for many years, and what Robert's doing here is just creating another little hub for them to delay matters or move things to the side because of the pandemic. There is a huge backlog of issues that have got to be dealt with, and the minute they get up to speed with this particular idea will be probably an idea that wasn't as good as it was supposed to be, and subsequently will disappear. So I think they can get it right without having to create another tier of management, or as you say, marriage guidance, or whatever the next word will be for it. But I think the reality is that it's just because there is a backlog, and he's thinking, okay, well, this is a nice way to sort of push this to the side for a while, and free the courts up for the work. Now, for landlords, it's probably not that exciting because they're thinking, right, I've got to go down this route and I've probably got to pay for this. And if that doesn't work, I've still got to go to court. So there's another cost section that's going to be involved. So it's not as exciting as it looks on paper, but I think it's another management role that's just been created.
This is, well, I suppose in the middle of a mayoral election, it would be inevitable that there would be some debate between the various parties. This is a bit of a spat between the NRLA, which is the National Residential Landlords Association, and Sadiq Khan. But I thought if we talk, rather than the politics of this, let's talk about the rights or wrongs of rent controls in London, because they were in place for quite a few years, up until 1988. And an independent report done, a report by the Treasury done in 2010 under the last Labour government basically said that they thought that rent controls, basically, the only thing they achieved really was the depletion of the inner city stock, and by the lack of investment, because there was very few people looking to get involved in the sector because everything was under rent control. But on the other side of the argument, I suppose you could say, well, look, rents are getting crazy, particularly in the centre of London, or they have been in the past. And maybe there should be some kind of regulation. So I kind of guess where you're going to sit on this, but there are two sides to the story. Sadiq Khan is saying, obviously, it's got way out of hand. It needs some control. And then NRLA are turning around and saying, well, hang on a minute, you've got powers to invest in the marketplace anyway to get more people to offer private rented stock. So who's right and who's wrong?
Yeah, I think the reality of it is that first of all, it's investment. So for someone to actually then govern that investment, I don't really see that. It doesn't sit well with me. So let's put it in sort of context. You and I went and bought a property that we want to have a return on our investment, and the market rents are saying that it's worth X, and people are prepared to pay that, and if they're not, then we'll wait until such time as they do. That's market forces. It's like going to a supermarket and saying, well, that's the price of baked beans, and because everybody else is now, if one Sainsbury's and the other one's Tesco's, they decide to compete with each other to reduce, that's fine. What you can't do is go out there and say to them, actually, you can all have to charge X because that's the way it should be. And that doesn't work in any in a democratic world. It doesn't work to say that they can do that. But what Mr. Khan can do, of course, is do what primarily is one of his jobs is to build more properties in London and provide more stock, so that there isn't a supply and demand issue for renters. And if the supply was available and the right supply was available, then the young people would go and rent those properties at a lower rate, because that's what would happen. And the other thing is that they have a lot of stock of their own, these local authorities, and be it London or any of and they sit on it because they become rubbish. They've deteriorated. And they could recycle them and put them back in. Then there's a lot of houses that families would love to have. I know that in my business and my time, I've gone past homes, and they've been sitting there empty, boarded up, and they belong to the council. And you ask yourself, hang on a minute, they're saying there's a home shortages. What about all this? These are lying empty. Even if they weren't going to be used for another 5 years, it would make financial sense for them to go and refurbish and put a family in there, and at least get those people off the street, rather than have them in a line or put in a hotel or put into some hostel situation in a one room and put a family into this. Why do that when they actually have and own stock themselves that they just can't be bothered to refurbish? So for someone to sort of put that onus on the market and say they got to control that, I think what Mr. Khan needs to do is look in the mirror and say, how much stock do I have that needs refurbishing? And maybe what I'll do for my people that pay the rent, their rates to my London borough, to the central government, is I'll provide these homes and put these families in homes that we've got some control. I'll spend that money there. Instead of spending his time and energy and money trying to tell investors, good sound investors, how to run their business. That's what my view is.
Why do you think Khan is saying that the market is unfit for purpose? What does he mean by that?
I don't understand his point that the market is unfit for purpose. He can only put that down to the fact that there is a shortage of properties and people are suffering at the moment, especially over the last 12 months, and subsequently rents are too high. But that will change in a heartbeat as we get back on the treadmill. And of course, as you know, tomorrow millions of people, even if it rains or shines or snows, will be sitting in the gardens of some pubs just to have a draft pint of beer, just because they're going to be let out. So it doesn't matter whether it rains, shines, or people want to do the things, and they will come back and do the same thing here as time is going on. But I think if it's unfit for purpose, what is unfit for purpose is the fact that there is lots of properties that the councils own, which are boarded up, left derelict, not maintained, and they would be wise to spend some of that money on those properties and put them back into recirculation.
Now, this is an old one that we've discussed before, but a new slant on it because there's some figures, and you know I love my figures. So the question is that over half, or rather the point being that over half of home buyers never visit an estate agent's office during their transaction process. Home buyers are divided on whether an agency needs a branch office in a high street or anywhere else for that matter. So 54% say that branches are not important, 46% say they are. But interestingly, the majority, 53%, didn't venture into the office throughout the entire transaction. So is there a need to go to the office anymore?
The answer to that is no, there isn't a need to go to the office anymore. Because, and if you look back at it historically, we used to make appointments, and let's say it's a vacant property, we'd meet the buyers at the property. The only reason they would come back to the office back in those days was that they may need, we used to take a deposit, for example. So they'd come back and put a deposit. Well, they don't pay a deposit anymore, but they'd pay a deposit. And even if they wanted to pay a deposit today, they stand on their little smartphone and go, ping, here's your deposit. I don't need to come to the office anymore. In those days, they was coming in to write a check and get a receipt. So that made a difference. Those that paid a deposit, they would come into the office and obviously go through their mortgage application and apply for mortgage application. And Bob will probably have a word or two about that. But the time was then when people would come into the office and you'd physically go through a mortgage application and take the survey fee and actually process that. That now, a good percentage of that is done online. So they don't tend to come in. They don't even go into their building society. Forget about going to their estate agents branches. You know, even the banks and the building societies have been shutting branches left, right, and centre because everything is online, and people are actually doing that through an online system. So yeah, I think there is lesser need for people to come to the offices. However, I still think that it's important that there should be somewhere, if they felt that they needed to go and have a discussion, some private matters, things that can't always be discussed over the phone, things that can't be discussed online, and they feel comfortable. And I still provide that where, you know, I know a lot of my clients, old and new and younger generation, will come in and sit down and just try and talk it through. And I think that still has to exist. I don't think it has to exist on the high street. I don't think it had to exist on the high street for years, to be perfectly honest with you. It's not just recent. I mean, we're talking last 10, 15 years, it hasn't really existed. I think we just feel that we need to be on the high street so people can actually see us from a marketing point of view and be present and say, oh yeah, that's the company I will use.
Interesting that the report says that 6% of people, only 6%, bought their new home from the adverts in the shop window, and only 5% bought their property from a sale board, whereas 70% bought their home from finding it online, and 18% word of mouth or direct from the seller. So if there's any evidence that you needed to say that the world of estate agency or the conveyancing process is moving online, there it is.
Absolutely. I mean, you go back only 10 years, 15 years, and in my area, we used to have the property news, and I'm sure everybody knows in their own area, they would have a Informer or a property journal of some sort, which is quite thick and heavy, would land through your door every Thursday, Friday, and you would, over a coffee, wade through that and go, oh yeah, I'd like to look at that. Just things have changed. Now they sit on their smartphone and go onto a portal and go do the same thing. So you still got to, but do they come to the office? That was the point. And the answer is no, they don't, and they don't need to. But I still think that that facility should be made available because I think it's a comfort. The important thing people must understand is that this is the most expensive amount of money mentally you will spend. And I think it's very, very important for people to feel comfortable in their purchase and understand and have that knowledge. And of course, I'm here offering you 40 years worth of experience. So, feel free to come in and see me.
I'm in a provocative mood this morning, so I'm going to be provocative now.
Oh, I love it when you talk dirty.
Here's a suggestion to you, Joe, then. So, if we don't need branches anymore, and a lot of them have been shedding branches, why are the fees not cheaper?
Yeah, the fees are not cheap. Well, actually, the fees have become cheaper, Paul. They are cheaper and cheapened, should I say. So just watch that word. It's cheapened as opposed to being cheaper. So when you're going to get non-experts who just open up the next day like Purple Bricks and charge you at $199 to sell your house, that is cheapened. It doesn't mean that it's cheaper. So yeah, there's always going to be someone out there, but I can also give you as many examples of those people that have paid those cheaper and cheapened fees who then come back and say, I've been on the market for the last 6 months. I haven't seen anyone. No one's contacted me. I've got a board outside my house and I haven't sold my property. Well, that's what happens when you go to a cheaper agent who isn't really an agent, who's just jumped on the bandwagon. And then they come to a proper estate agent and they get the service and they get the value for money and they get the results. So time is money. If you want to pay $199 and sit there for 6 months, hey, go right ahead and do it. But if you want a proper job and you've got to pay a proper fee for it, then come along and see us.
75% of people said they'd be happy to pay less fees if there wasn't a branch to attend. So not surprisingly, they're saying, yeah, make the fees cheaper and we don't care whether you have a branch or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they would say that. Everybody would say that, Paul. God, in the business that you do and I do, anyone's going to say make it cheaper. It doesn't necessarily mean cheap is best. You can go down to some of these great shops. Why do they still exist? Why do big stores and big brands still exist? Why do people buy brands? If they can go and buy one from, I don't know, a cheaper brand at the same price. Why do people go and buy brands when they actually turn around and say they can have their own? Take someone like Tesco's as an example. They might have Heinz baked beans, which is a brand, and people still buy those in volumes and pay the price for it, as opposed to Tesco's own product. I mean, the content's probably not different. It just says the brand is different. But will they continue to do that? How many people actually shun the fact, I don't want to buy that, it's cheaper, just because it looks different? So I think that's, marketeering is such that people look at these things and say, I think I don't mind paying cheaper. But when it comes to the crunch, I don't think that's true.
Be interested to see what people think on the comments today on this particular issue. Do you think it's important that a company has a branch system to give it the kind of respect it perhaps needs, or do you think it doesn't matter anymore? Be interested to see what you think. I think Bob was saying that he was looking at launching an online franchise model in the future, and of course a lot of people have gone that route already, like the sort of Purple Bricks idea that you talk about. So interesting to get people's feedback on that. Expensive is not always the best. Just had a comment through on that as well. Last story then this week, buyers may, there's a bit of deja vu here, Joe, but buyers may already be too late to get the new stamp duty deadline. So to get the maximum 500,000 relief, you've got to get it in by the 30th of June. And of course, as we said earlier on, it's taking 163 days on average, 138 if you live in the east, or 222 if you're in the southwest. So basically, you're not going to get through by June the 30th unless you really get your skates on. And you will have to go down to the 250,000 limit, of course, which is how it's being tapered away to the 30th of September before returning to the standard 125. So we've seen this before, haven't we, Joe?
And where's that fella that said that the system had to be changed earlier on in our conversation, where he says,
"Oh
that,
yes, Rob Hailstone."
Yeah, Rob, maybe he can put some light on the matter that the system is only bucked by the trend of the legals. No one else. I mean, the agents have actually done their bit and created the sales. It's now the meat is in the sausage machine. And unfortunately, it ain't coming out the other end due to the conveyancing system, which is archaic. So it's not the agents that are bucking the trend here. Unfortunately, I've got my little final say in that matter. It is the conveyancing system that is going to, unfortunately, create a problem for these buyers who want to try and meet the deadline of the 30th of June in order to benefit. So I think if there was a penalty put on the legal lot to say, if this isn't done and I'm going to lose it, they might actually do something about it. But it's always going to be someone else's fault. It's always going to be searches. It's always going to be the council. It's always going to lie on someone else's doorstep in order to make sure that that's where it is. But I wouldn't be here if we had all these things perfect, would it? I mean, there'd be nothing for me to moan about.
So that's our stories this week. Let's take a look at an interesting new property that's up for auction on the 27th of April, Joe. This is in Reading, I think, isn't it?
It's Caversham, just a little bit outside Reading. So not too far a walk to the Thames. If you fancy to walk there. A little investment property. It's got plenty of scope, actually. It's got a little shop at the moment, and it's got an extension planning permission to the ground floor to provide. So when you see that picture there, to the left-hand side, there's a bit of space, and then all of that is extendable to the back. So you could considerably have a larger retail operation downstairs if you wanted. And then to the back, there's plenty of space where you can grow. And there's even a further plot to the back of it where there's scope to maybe develop. So a nice corner site with retail to the ground floor and residential to the upper, and scope for extension and potentially scope for develop further. We have that in our auction on the 27th. There's the aerial picture, so you can see it's a nice corner plot. Good investment opportunity. Legal packs online. Any further information, please do not hesitate to call, and we'll make an appointment for you to have a look at it. It's vacant, ready to go. Good investment, good return.
So what do you think would go on there, Joe? Any ideas?
Well, there's scope to put a workshop to the end of that, I think, or even parking. I was thinking that in the neighborhood has got parking issues. You could actually rent parking spaces and just make money off the back plot for parking if you just wanted to do that. But I'm sure some sort of development will go at the end of that garden, maybe another house or a workshop of some sort. A good mixed use, really. Good opportunity. If you look to the mirror image of it on the other side of the street, so if you went to the other end of the road, there's a mirror. There's a guy there who's extended to the back and sublet that out, and so obviously there's more income coming out. So there's certainly scope to develop on this particular property.
And a guide price of 575.
575,
plus fees.
575, and obviously that's being the guide price. So we're hoping to achieve a lot more than that. Fingers crossed that the day brings us good luck.
27th of April 2021. Auction starts at 12:30. So Joe, your subject this week is DIY.
Yeah. So my subject DIY, Paul, this last week, it was quite interesting. And it's good to be always to speak from personal experiences. I think that's important to do. And so here I am, at our home, the lower roof needed TLC, should I say? It just, so we've got over a 200-year-old cottage, and it's been some years since we did it. And of course, you end up having to say, right, well, I've got to do something with this. And so my subject is really about agreeing terms with the builders and dealing with things in the right way. And it's very easy for costs to run away and not see that. And I had that first-hand experience where we'd agreed a price, and obviously when the old roof part was lifted, the brickwork underneath was, let's say, a little to be desired. So immediately that caused problems in time, delay, and then finding a brickie to come along and do it. I was lucky. A good friend of mine who was a master builder, master brickie, was able to come along and help me. But I was just thinking that under normal circumstances, that whole operative would have just delayed. Now, you don't really know what's underneath. This is the problem with DIY, isn't it? And sometimes you want to touch it, but then you want to not touch it. And the reason why you don't want to touch it is because you know the minute you've taken that one bit down, there's going to be something else, and then something else. And before you know it, what you think you're going to spend on it is almost double to what you end up spending on it. So, it's very, very important to try and understand and get good advice. It's back to good advice, good consultancy, and get a clear picture of that. And those things exist because, unfortunately, if you say to somebody, I want the plaster done, well, they'll do the plaster, but the minute they take the plaster down, they don't know if the support mechanism at the back for the plaster is good enough. Is it rotten? Are the electrics now needing updating? Now, while I've got this, maybe I'll update the electric. And before you know it, you've gone into, a whirlwind of costs and things. And it's sometimes, I think, important to just take stock and think about further than the bit that you think you need doing. And that's really the education of my story, is that in spite of the fact that I've done things in the property world for as many years as I have, you still sometimes are drawn back to the basics and think, I should have looked at this, and this. And, and what really came to that conversation was that when your builder comes along and says to you that, that delay means I'm hanging around for an extra hour, so does that mean you're going to pay me more? And I'm saying, well, actually, if you actually roll your sleeve up and help the guy, you wouldn't be hanging around, and you're already being paid for the job as a job to do. So there's always an angle. Everybody's looking for an angle of how they're going to make more money, but they actually don't look at the long term. So I had a little bit of an education trip for this young chap. And I said to him that, you've got to think about your investment, the time. If you're doing one job good, you're going to get 10 other people. But if you're already starting to go down this road, then you might do this one and might get extra money, but the chances of you actually getting further work is actually less than. So you've got to look at the investment in your marketing side of it. But the message to all those at home really is about making sure that you do your research properly, and if necessary, call in someone that can actually see beyond. And that's going to be someone that has got a lot of experience in it. And show you that there are other things that may be worth looking at and costing while you're doing, especially things like plumbing and electrics, because the last thing you want to do is do the whole work and then find out that you've actually got to chase the channel back down again because the wiring has to be updated, and you should have done that when that was done. Or there's a pipe there that is an old pipe, a lead pipe for argument's sake, and that pipe now needs to be reconnected or redone. So all of those things are very, very important. So whilst DIY in the first instance is a good idea, aesthetically it looks good because you want it to look pretty. To get it to prettiness, there is a horrible journey about getting all the muck done. And that's the bit that I suppose I wanted to share today, is that you've got to look at beyond the prettiness in order to be able to get through to it. And we had that experience recently, on a couple of properties where you think, I've done this, and then someone else comes along and does something differently. And there's never a situation you can put two builders, two plumbers, whatever, into the room, and the first thing one will say about the others, I wouldn't have done it that way.
Yeah.
because he now doesn't want it to be that way inclined. So it's never the case. I can almost put, if I had a penny for every time somebody says that, it'd be great. But you just brought someone else because they're biting and say, "Oh, I wouldn't have done that way." The first thing the guy said to me the other day, he said, "Why does he put black pipes, not red pipes?" I said, "I don't know, what difference does the color pipe of the pipes make?" "Yeah, but in the ground you put red pipes, you don't put the black pipes." So am I supposed to know that as a layman? I mean, are you employ a plumber to say, "I need this pipe done"? He goes down the road and does it, and it now works. As long as it works, it doesn't matter. But another one comes along and says, "Yeah, but that should have been red pipes, not black pipes." I mean, you know what? What difference does it make at the end? They're going underground. But the point is that there'll always be something that will do. So the message really is that, take stock, think about it, almost write it down maybe, and say, look, here are the bits that might need doing, and then make sure you've got it calculated, and then it's no big surprise at the other end, because there will be a surprise, definitely.
And I guess, of course, because of the pandemic, more and more people have been doing their own DIY, haven't they? Through necessity.
Oh, I mean, one of the industries that has stayed steadfast throughout this has been the property industry, not only through buying, selling, but whilst people have been at home, they've been thinking, right, this is a job that I've been looking to tackle, and I've got to do it. Now that the weather is a little bit more fairer on our sides, they are looking to do all of those things. And I'm just saying that take stock and write it down and think about not just the bit that you need to do, but the problems that bit's going to cause beyond, and calculate for that. And it's only because I've just gone through it, and irrespective of knowing the answers myself, you still need to sort of revisit it. And in hindsight, I probably just thought, okay, well, I'm going to need to do that. But you don't know what's on it. If you're not a builder, you're not a roofer, you're not going to know what's behind that. But guaranteed, the minute you do take it down, you almost wish you hadn't. It was better to just leave it rickety than and live with the water leaks than to take it down. But anyway, it's done now, so it has to be done.
Wise words as always, Joe. Thank you very much indeed. Time, as always, is beating us once again. So I think that's probably where we need to leave it for this week. So, Joe, thank you as always for your thoughts, and thank you for watching Property Matters this week. We'll be back, of course, with another live show for you next Sunday at 10 o'clock.